Judge Walker.
The national thinking is to move away from congregate care to the extent that it's possible, with the idea that there is more engagement, there's more well-being for children. One of the things that's brought in time has been human trafficking and the fact that children who run away from foster care are at very high risk for child sexual exploitation. And one of the ways of avoiding that is having that more engagement, more supervision, more monitoring in more family-like settings.
And we saw that with the shelters that were closed as a result of the pressures of that lawsuit also, which is they weren't well managed, they weren't well supervised, people didn't have that one-to-one attachment, and children were being exploited, right? They were walking out of the facilities and terrible things were happening as a criminal matter, those kinds of things. So I think that's right. The other thing, and you know more about this even than I do, but there was this new movement towards sort of trauma-informed approaches and trauma-informed systems and trauma-informed care. That's a complex thing to talk about in some ways, but with respect to this idea of family-based foster care, the idea is for children who've experienced trauma, what helps us overcome that and builds that resilience and helps us reorient is personal contact, attachments, relationships. And so that we can foster that, not to overuse the word, foster that in a traditional foster care home better than we can where there's staff that changes and shifts, right? And that kind of thing is some of that too, I think. Okay. National perspective, comparable to the slide we looked at before, but only with respect to foster care. Here's where we stand. So after that safe reduction movement, where do we stand? Georgia actually leads the country in terms of the safe reduction of children in foster care. That our foster care population, and this is, again, a little bit dated. There are a few states now that have edged us out a little bit at the top if you're feeling that competitive spirit. But essentially, Georgia reduced its foster care population by about 50%. And that was dramatic. And we stand out among states in that regard. And there are many states, and again, this is something we can't see when we're feeling, all the pressures of fixing our own system. There are many states who are saying, what did Georgia do? We'd like to do what Georgia did.
But
right?
I think it's important to point out that we didn't do it at the expense
Of safety.
Of safety.
That's right. That's why those two together.
That's the question that people are
Yep.
going to ask. Is,
Yep.
We have to not foster care.
That's exactly right.
Keep them in situations that were dangerous.
That's exactly right. So we know what and again, these are slices of a really robust data, outcomes metrics for our system. I want to keep saying that because these are selected for a reason, but largely to simplify the conversation. What we know is sort of indicators of a healthy system are a low foster care population. That speaks to our values and what we think this intervention is for, and also the limits on state authority from a legal perspective. Low foster care population, but not just as a matter of keeping the numbers low, not as a matter of quota, right? But instead we've got to make sure that we're using that intervention correctly. And what tells us that is that safety, those safety measures, like the recurrence of maltreatment that we've looked at. So we know that we've reduced our foster care population, but children are safe in their families and communities. Right? Unlike what we saw in 2004, where we had an explosive population of foster care and our safety numbers were much worse. And that probably isn't that intuitive, but that's in fact what happened. Opportunities and challenges, and some of your questions have already gotten us here. And these are really just my thoughts. These are just kind of jumping off places for our conversation, not in any way meant to foreclose your own ideas, but thinking again in those big buckets of safety, permanency, and well-being, which is how our system is designed, measured, and operationalized. Let's look at a few opportunities. So with respect to safety, I mentioned, probably one of the biggest challenges, and I think it speaks back to my soapbox, my theory, is that one of the most transformative things we can do for this system is to work towards restoring the public confidence in this system. And to do so by having an understanding, a sophisticated understanding of what it is that we're doing well, and reframing that narrative for our system. And then being honest and confronting those things that we're not doing well. So that's a transparent and candid conversation. Because at the end of the day, we need people out in the community who are going to identify, who are going to be vigilant, who are going to be detectors of child abuse and neglect, and make that report to the department because they're confident the department will respond appropriately. And because the department is the sole authority to be able to respond with the state's power in these families. So this is a visual from actually the National Incidence Study. National Incidence Study is a really comprehensive, rigorously, sort of complex methodology study that's commissioned by Congress periodically. The NIS-4 just came out in 2010. A couple of things about the NIS-4 that are of interest. For the first time in all of the national incidence studies that have spanned now a decade or more, they concluded that there actually has been a decrease in the overall incidence of child abuse and neglect. Something otherwise we'd want to celebrate. But here's what we also know. That incidence is what measured at the top of that iceberg. That's the stuff that we know about. And we really only have the tip of the iceberg in terms of the things that we know about that are reported to our child protective authorities. Now, there are also other slices just under the sort of figurative, right, the figurative seascape here, sea line, that we know that there are a number of children who are being abused and neglected who are known to other public officials, sort of government actors. For example, police, juvenile probation, public health, schools, hospitals. And it may strike you, well, those sound like mandated reporters. Why are they under the surface of the water? I think that's something we should think about. Now, this just isn't a Georgia problem. This is systemic nationally. This is our big challenge, right? Our big bite. The idea here is, do we have mandated reporters who know that they're mandated reporters? Are they well supported and trained to fulfill that duty of making that report? Do we have institutional policies or customs that interfere with the making of that report? We have some complicated sort of nuanced laws in Georgia about how you make reports through complex systems like hospitals and schools. Sometimes we get stories about things being kind of confounded in those areas. And then importantly, are they not making those reports because they don't believe that our system is going to respond appropriately? I do think that's a big one, and a responsibility we all carry. And then we have, of course, really deeply there are the things that are really concealed from all of us, children that aren't known to any of us. These are, with respect to all of these kids, but certainly those are the places where will the neighbor call? Does the grandmother who has a suspicion, is she willing to sort of stand up and do something? Right? When you see something happen in a parking lot, do you know who to call? Some of the rationale, and I realize it's a little bit controversial, but some of the rationale I think around that public 800 number is, if I witness something, I'm a complete stranger, unfamiliar with this family and situation that's going on, but I witness something, then I'm better equipped to make a call and sort of initiate the response if there's an 800 number that I can quickly recall and call in, as opposed to navigating local systems. So this is just something to be thoughtful about. How is it that what is our detection system? How well are we executing on that? We want a detection system that's specific and sensitive, that we know that we are getting all of the children we need to get and not a single one more, ideally. This as well speaks to some of the challenge, and frankly, I think some of the challenges that we're seeing perhaps in the high-profile cases in terms of things we can learn from that. These are trends in CPS caseloads. For the last handful of years, and again, I know that these are a little bit difficult. The most recent line, this is really the important thing. You see in month 12, you start to see a little bit of leveling off or decline in every year except this year, which is the light blue line that shoots up. Now, this is a resource issue, for one thing, for sure, and the governor has committed his resources, the state's resources, to start to address this problem. But this is when I want to echo back to what we knew about 2004. In some ways, at some levels, if you will, this is a problem you can throw money at. But you can't just throw money at it, because we'll get it wrong. That these staff have to be well supported. They have to be trained, supervised, right? We have to make sure that we have a stable workforce that's not turning over all of the time. These are workforce issues, right? But at the end of the day, our workforce issue means we also have a potential child safety issue, right? So I just want to share that with you as well.
Melissa, can you just add to that after talking to DFACS at the conference this past week, centralized intake has caused, we're seeing a huge increase in the number of reports of child abuse and neglect. So while money may not solve any issues and there are a lot of resources the governor's already committed, I think we also have to keep in mind in trying to come up with recommendations that changes to the system caused by the uptick that we expect not to really decline again.
Here's always, and this isn't all that you're saying much more than that. Yes, so one, the centralized intake changes in practice, some of those trends we see over time. This is one that we're going to look at, and you'll see a blip in our data when we look at this right now. I think at certain intervals of time, DFACS has experienced almost 4 times the amount of calls that we see routinely. That's huge. It's tremendous. And not all of those calls necessarily mean that all those children are legitimately abused or neglected, right? So they have to have enough resources, personnel and otherwise, to ferret out, to do all of the intake that's required, then to explore and follow through with those that require some follow-up. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is a more global issue that I want to point out that your comment raised for me, which is anytime we do better with data, you're going to see changes. Anytime we understand issues better, we're going to know more, detect more, have more information, and you'll see changes in data over that. You have to remember that because not all of these, if you will, are real effects. Right? Data just kind of gives us an ability, we got to translate this against what we know from practice and our own experience, et cetera. Because some of these upticks, maybe we just understand better what we're doing, we're measuring it better, we're watching more closely. So those are just some general thoughts around the sort of safety. Again, not exhaustive by any means, just something to kind of percolate for you. In the permanency realm, these are from the Child and Family Services Review. These are kind of our trends, our performance trends around big domains in the permanency area. Again, not all of them. But you see, what you see in that dashed line, kind of a third of the way down, is where the national standards are. So that gives you a sense of where we hover with respect to the national standards. Relative has some value for comparison purposes. So timely reunification measures for all children who are discharged in a given period of time. How many of them were reunified with their families within 12 months, measured against a 12-month interval. That 12 months is not arbitrary. It is at some level, but not in the way you think. Not as a data measure. It's actually in the law. So the law sort of projects out a 12-month timeline. It's a good time for me to reference to you, and we're not going to talk about it in detail. I did give you a flow chart of how the juvenile court process works so that you can get a sense of kind of the accelerated timeline, some of which correspond, or these correspond to those. So for children who are in foster care, they're also overseen by the juvenile courts through a whole process around dependency, as we call it in the state. And you can see some of how quickly those hearings and decisions have to be made. And so that's a feature of foster care cases as well. But and the court determines permanency as well, right? The court has to authorize the reunification, discharge the case, all of those kinds of things. So the court's role is also embedded in these dynamics. Timely reunification, you see we're kind of right at or just below the national standard. This is one we want to watch. Right, one we could maybe do better on. And again, the underlying values framework from a public policy standpoint is children belong with their families. So for those children who can be reunified with their own families, are we doing so essentially timely, right? When it's safe and appropriate to do so, but with some intention about the timeline. Judge Walker.
So we may not see those reunification numbers go up because we are doing a much better job of not removing children.
Right.
Unless we have
That's a
exhausted
good point.
every other option. Sometimes when you get to that point, reunification is not going to
Yep.
take place because you've already used all the resources.
Yes.
So I can't say with certainty that that number is going to go back.
I think that's a fair point, and it takes us back to, I appreciate that, it takes us back to a comment I wanted to make, right, about when we decreased our foster care population. That meant we moved out the kids who were easy to move out, so to speak. We got kids home who needed to be home. We got kids to adoptions and guardianships who could be in family situations. That means that the core of our foster care population is really tough. These are kids with really high behavioral and mental health needs, largely. That speaks to perhaps, kind of a related but important, relevant system, right, our children's mental health system, and whether we have the array of services and supports we need so that these children don't have to be in the state's custody but can be supported elsewhere. And so to your point, I think that's exactly right. Those kinds of dynamics also speak to our data trends, right? Which is if we've only got those really hard kids in our system, it's going to be harder to get them moved to permanency quickly within a timeline. Yes.
Illness with very little support. And those cases are extraordinarily difficult with regard to reunification. So it's not just the mental health system of the children that
True.
we're going to have to face. We're going to have to face
Sure.
the adult mental health system because these parents are very impaired.
And you and I had this conversation too, which was great, which is, all of our systems are moving towards, and you can term it in big broad themes, right, deinstitutionalization. So we move kids out of foster care, we move our adults out of our state mental health hospitals and our developmentally disabled out of those kinds of congregate care homes. Frankly, we're looking at reentry around offenders as they come out of our prison system. All of that means we have more pressures at that community level to make sure that families are whole and safe and stable and fortified, and that's a huge issue right now.
Melissa,
Yeah.